Hi everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Devi Parikh, and I've been asked by the workshop organizers to prepare a talk on some advice that I would give junior faculty. And so that's what this is going to be about. Um, I wouldn't think of this so much as me saying that this is what I think you should be doing if you are a junior faculty. I would think of it more as these are some things that I did that I thought were effective, and so I think would be useful to share. I'm sure you would get different advice depending on who you're talking to, and that's kind of the beauty of academia, right? That we have the freedom to be able to decide how we want to structure our work, structure our lives, and all of those good things. So yeah, so just take these as examples of things that worked well for me, and so I wanted to share with you. I don't have a set of slides. There isn't anything too terribly visual about what I'm going to say, and so what I have are sort of a series of bullet points of some structured thoughts of things that I wanted to share. I've tried to group them by topic to some extent, so there's some structure, but outside of there, it's in somewhat arbitrary order. And so, right, and you will notice me look over to the side every so often, but that's because I'm referring to my notes that has the list of things I want to talk about. So with that, let me get started. And so, as I mentioned, that this is specifically for junior faculty. And so it's not talking about things like what important research problems are or how I decide what to work on and things like that, because I think that is applicable also to industry researchers and is not specific to academia. All right, and so let me get started. So the first one that I have here is that it is important to hire good students. These are individuals who you'll be working with for several years, you'll be seeing on a regular basis, you'll be collaborating with on a regular basis. And so it's good to have individuals who you think you can have a good sort of equation and a good relationship with, where you are getting something out of interacting with them, they're getting something out of interacting with you. And so sometimes I feel like junior faculty feel the pressure to kind of hire students as soon as possible, hire many students as soon as possible, because you're worried that if you don't have students, then how are you going to get started on your research and so on. But I would be quite careful at that stage to make sure that some of the first few students that you hire play a critical role, both in your experience as junior faculty and also in terms of setting the culture for your lab, for your research group. And so I think it is okay to go a little bit slow. And so even if your group grows slower than what you anticipated or what you think, how fast other people's groups are growing, I think that's completely fine. And so, yes, I think it's important to take your time and to hire a good set of students, especially at the beginning, but even after that. And so, in line with that, I think it's useful to try and find a system for recruiting students, for evaluating applicants that works well for you. I think it is often the case where if there is like a department level admissions committee or there's a department level admissions process and applications come in and a bunch of people are looking at those and there's some process through which some applications get picked, there can be variance in terms of how much input you feel you had in that process. And so I think it's okay to think of things that you can do outside of that system potentially that let you get more information. So, for example, maybe it's plausible for you to set up conversations with some of these applicants before you make decisions. Maybe you can let the applicants know ahead of time that these are some topics that you would want to talk about, or here's a particular paper that you would want to talk about, so that you can have more grounded conversations and try and get certain signals that you think would be helpful. It might also be okay to ask applicants if they have some code available online on GitHub or something of that sort, so that you can get additional information if that's not something that they shared as part of their application already. So you do have to be careful that sort of you don't have biases that are creeping in the process of doing this. But at the same time, I think it's also useful to think about how you can be resourceful and try and get some additional signal than sort of just what might be happening in your department as hundreds or thousands of applications are being evaluated. So it's worth, that might take more time and effort on your part, but going back to my earlier point, I think it's important to get this right. And so it's worth doing. Another thing to consider that's relevant to this is that PhD students are not the only students you can be working with, right? You can work with master students. You can hire them as GRAs, maybe after working with them for a semester, so you see if there's a good fit. There are also a lot of undergraduate students who sometimes are taking a year off, where they're looking for research experience. They're looking to build their resume in terms of their research contributions, maybe trying to get a publication. And so they might be taking a year off between their undergrad and before when they want to start grad school. And so those could be individuals that you could hire in your lab as interns. And what's nice about these things is that one, it gives you more flexibility on the size of your group, in the sense that you're not making like 5-year commitments, promising to fund someone for 5-6 years. And so if you don't know what your funding situation is going to look like, working with master students or these 1-year interns can give you a way of being able to adapt your group as your funding situation changes. And the other nice thing, especially with the 1-year interns, is that they are often not taking classes, right? They're not students on campus. They are employees who are doing research. And so they are just focusing on research for the whole year. And so that can be a nice way for them to be able to be more productive than what you might think would be the case for most, for example, first, second year PhD students or even master students. So that's something that's worth looking into. What these positions look like, what the hiring looks like, probably varies across universities, but this is something that both Dhruv Batra and I have been able to do successfully at Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech. So we have a few data points of that. So I think that's one theme of hiring good students, being resourceful in terms of being able to find strong students, and sort of using these other venues beyond just PhD students to be able to grow your group in a more flexible way. The next couple of points that I want to talk about is about promoting yourself, your work, your students, your group, and things of that sort. So I know that this can sometimes feel a little funny, but I think it's important to tell the world about your work, right? That I'm not saying that you should pick research problems that you think the world cares about, or I think, although some might advise that, I personally haven't quite functioned that way. So even if you pick problems that you are personally excited about, you're not really sure if anybody else would care about it or not. I think it's still important to go out and tell the world why you think this is exciting, why you think it's important, why they should know about it, and so on. And to some extent, science is a social endeavor, right? So if you don't communicate what you're doing and what you found and what you think is interesting, then you're not really going to be contributing to science as much as you could, right? So I think that's one, even sort of as a matter of principle, if you will. But I think other things are that sort of when you're communicating your work, you end up sort of forming a bit of a community, you get some feedback. You end up hearing more about others' work, and it's just sort of a richer experience. And finally, it is the case that when you get evaluated for various things, right, whether it is your tenure case, or whether it is some sort of an award that you're going to get, some grant proposal where they might be looking at the abilities of the PI that is listed on the grant and so on. If people don't know you, if they don't know your work, they're just going to have a harder time evaluating. And so I think even the reality of the world is that it is useful if the community knows what you're working on. And so this applies both to yourself, but also your students, right? That I think in the same spirit, promoting your students and their work, I think is important. Related to that, in the context of students, look out for internship opportunities, fellowship opportunities, things of that sort that maybe junior students don't necessarily know to keep an eye out on. I feel like as time is progressing, students are showing up much better informed than, for example, I was when I started grad school. But I think it's still useful for you to help with that and keep an eye out on various opportunities, things that they could apply for, including things like internal awards. A lot of departments or colleges have various internal awards for research or for teaching that is meant for graduate students, and so nominate them for that. And things of that sort. Basically try to do what you can to set them up for a successful career trajectory outside of, obviously, the research is the main driver, but I think these other things also matter, and so it's good to be mindful and do that to the extent that you can, to the extent that you feel comfortable. So I think that's the second theme. The third theme that I want to talk about is being intentional about the lab culture that you want to set up for your lab. I think a lot of times this kind of and that's what happened to me as well, but in hindsight, instead of sort of falling into some local minima or the culture just happening to be what it is, I think it's useful to think about what is it that you care about and what are things that you want to make sure your lab culture has and enables. And again, going back to my earlier point, I think that's one nice thing about academia, right? That you do get to set that culture to quite an extent. You have a lot of influence on what that will look like. And so it's useful to be intentional about that, to be conscious about it and take it seriously. So for example, some things that are a part of my lab culture, a lot of this also correlates to Dhruv Batra's lab because we tend to run our labs together. But things like, even small things like Slack, that we have a fairly active Slack team. All the projects are channels on the Slack. They're all public in the sense of like within the lab. And so any student can just join any channel and sort of keep track of it, see what's going on, be informed, even if they're not explicitly working on it or explicitly collaborating on it. And so that's been a big part. We have a lot of fun reactions, and students, and including me and Dhruv, and when we've had postdocs and research scientists, everyone is often joking around on the random channel. So yeah, things of that sort, that how active is the Slack, how active is communication on a day-to-day basis, is something that I think is useful to be intentional about. Things like group meetings, reading groups, how often do you want to do it? How is it structured? Is everyone presenting every time, or are different people presenting but for a longer amount of time? All of these things, I think thinking it through and being intentional about it is useful. Some other things that we do is we have these lab retreats that used to be annual, now they're twice a year, where all the entire lab, both my lab and Dhruv Batra's lab, we'll go somewhere, usually local. It's like driving distance, and we'll have a series of presentations, and we'll have a series of questions that we've asked students, and everyone is going around answering them. Dhruv and I answer them as well. We have some activities planned around it. And so things like that, it sort of ends up being a good time to take a step back and think about more meta things in life than we might have a chance to do otherwise. And I know that has brought the lab much closer together, the students closer together, we are more accessible and more approachable as a consequence of that. And so that's something that I think works well. Other things like having high standards for presentations, where making sure that whatever you're saying is actually making sense, that the conclusions that you're drawing from the results that you see in your experiments are logically consistent, communication is clear. So thinking about the extent to which you want to push back on this, that if someone is presenting and they're not really making sense, do you want to sort of pause and have them think about what they're trying to say and kind of take a second shot at it? Kind of things. I think, questions of that sort, I think are useful to think about. And at a high level, I think the way I like to think about this is that how do I want my students to operate once they graduate, once they leave the lab? What influence are they going to have in whatever work environment they are in after graduating from here, and how do I want to influence that? And so I think thinking about the lab culture in that context, I think is useful. Another thing that is somewhat related to this, this is something that I suffered from, is to be careful to not get too attached to your first set of grad students. I think this happened to me, where we had this nice culture, everyone got along really well, and then when sort of that first wave of students graduated, I just felt like this doesn't even feel like my lab anymore, right? There are all the students left, and so it was hard for me to make that transition. And so I think being conscious of that, I don't know what exactly I should have done differently to avoid this, but if nothing else, then just a warning that this might be something that happens to you, and so you should keep an eye out for that. Another point that I want to make is it's a different topic from what I was saying so far, but invest in compute in the context of, especially for, I'm assuming many of you are probably using deep learning in your research. And so I think that's important. The iteration speed, how fast people can do experiments and look at results, plays a big role in how productive the lab can be. And there's nothing that explicitly says that academic labs can't have large compute clusters, right? And of course, it costs money, and that's something that I recommend you try and negotiate in your startup, or sort of try and raise funds explicitly for that. But I do think that a lot of faculty that I see around me, I feel like cap their compute cluster sooner than what I believe they have resources for. And so I think there tends to be a little bit of a mindset that says that, oh, as an academic lab, these many GPUs is reasonable, and people don't seem to push beyond that, when I think there's no reason not to. And like I said, I do get that you need resources for it, but I do feel like there's often more resources available than people tend to invest in compute. And so I would recommend, investing in compute and doing it from day one. Like building these servers and so on takes weeks or months sometimes. And so even before you start your position, if you can start building the cluster at wherever you know you're going to be joining, that can be useful, and continue to invest in it. Maybe have a few different faculty that are all coming together to build the cluster out. That's a shared resource. But thinking about that very intentionally, I think, is useful. Another thing to be intentional about is deciding how you want to spend your time. And I mean this in a couple of specific ways. And so one is in the context of teaching. That think about that if teaching is something that you get a lot of joy out of, if that is sort of your primary motivation in being faculty, then that's great. It makes a lot of sense to spend time and energy on that as much as you'd like. But if it is the case that your primary driver or your primary source of joy is through the research in an academic setting, then it is important, I think, to be very careful about how much time you end up signing up for in terms of teaching, especially in your first semester when you're teaching the first course. You don't have to design a course from scratch. You don't have to make all your slides from scratch. There are tons of courses that are being taught that are very relevant to most likely any topic that you're teaching. And so leverage those resources. A lot of faculty have been generous to put their content online. And so with due credit, obviously, I would recommend leverage that at least the first time you're teaching the course till you get a hang of it, till it becomes a part of your system. And then in future iterations, you can decide how much you want to tweak the course, which lectures you want to tweak, and so on. So as I said, if teaching is something that brings you as your primary source of joy, then it makes sense to invest a lot of time in it. But what I often see is that the primary source of joy is research, but then junior faculty haven't realized just how much time it takes to build a course from scratch. And so then they feel overwhelmed, and they feel like they're not making enough progress in research because they're spending so much time in teaching. So yeah, I would caution to be very careful with how you approach the first time you're teaching. And similar for coding. For me, for example, it wasn't an intentional decision to code less and less, and over time, at this point, I don't code much at all, especially at least a few years ago, I wasn't coding much at all. I've tried to bring that back up again. But this is something that just happened to me. I just ran out of time with all the students and collaborations and teaching and writing grant proposals. And so if coding is something that is important to you, if you feel like you enjoy that quite a bit, be protective of that time. Try and set aside some amount of time in the week where you know you'll be able to do hands-on things. Try and have a project where you're maybe not on the critical path, and so if you don't get time, that's okay. But if you do get time to make some progress, to prototype something, then yeah, try and be protective of that time and be intentional about whether or not you're okay with that slipping away from you. Another advice, and I realize that this is going longer than perhaps what I was shooting for. I was originally shooting for like a 20-minute talk, but this might be closer to 30. Hopefully that's okay. So another piece of advice is to put yourself out there in the context of asking for help. So when you're writing grant proposals, if you need someone to introduce you to some program managers at various funding institutions, reach out to people, ask them if they can make that introduction, if they can share their past proposals with you, maybe redacted versions if there is some, if there are certain ongoing ideas in there, maybe examples of both rejected and accepted grant proposals. So reach out to folks. And when you do get that introduction to a program manager, or if you decide to just cold email them, which I think is completely fine to do, send them a brief description of the idea that you're considering so they can already kind of get an early sense for what you're thinking about and whether they find that to be exciting. And so reach out, don't self-select, go after things that you're interested in going after, and see what happens, right? The worst case is that you won't hear back or someone will say no, which is not the end of the world. I had spent quite a bit of time. So this was especially when I was writing my NSF career proposal for the first time. I had gotten examples from over a dozen faculty who were a few years senior than what I was at various institutions. I had read them very carefully. I had thought of what are the kind of meta points that they are hitting, like not the substance of the grant of the proposal was obviously going to be different, but things like at what points do they talk about how they are the right person to be doing this research, at what point do they talk about why this direction is exciting, in what language, and how do they talk about sort of the various challenges and things of that sort. Like things like the first sentence of your proposal should start by describing what your career goal is, things like that. So this sort of this quote unquote formula, if you will, that many of these successful proposals were following. I tried to really get a sense for that, and I tried to sort of write my proposal around that. And so I had put in a lot of thought, effort, time into doing that, and I think that paid off. I feel like I got quite a bit better at writing grant proposals. Didn't necessarily translate into a much higher acceptance rate necessarily, especially for NSF. But I think I still found that to be a rewarding exercise, and so I think it's useful to identify these things that are important to you and sort of pour yourself into it to really get better and learn from other examples. Another tidbit related to grants in particular is that one thing I notice is that junior faculty often assume that if the proposal was on X, then the research that they're doing and the students that they're funding need to be exactly on that X. And I think there is more variance that is okay. So for example, in my case, I had written a grant proposal on visual question answering. It was a 5-year proposal, and that is what I was doing for the first couple of years. But after that, I was continuing to work in vision and language. Some of it was in VQA, in visual question answering specifically, but some of it was in other problems in vision and language. And hopefully I won't get into trouble for saying this, but I think that was completely fine, especially in the context of things like NSF proposals and so on. And so I think it's useful to give yourself that flexibility that as long as you're working in that rough space, you don't have to feel the pressure to stick to exactly what you said in your proposal. And so I think, again, this goes back to being a little resourceful, if you will. I'm trying to not, like I said, this is going longer than I expected, so I'm just trying to think of maybe a couple more salient points to make. I think one thing that's is more meta, but I think it's useful to take the time to get to know yourself, like get to know what your working style is, get to know how you like to manage your time, figure out what stresses you out, figure out what gives you joy, figure out what kinds of interactions you enjoy, what kinds of interactions you don't enjoy, what activities you want to contribute to. For example, when it comes to service for the department or college, figure out which ones can really leverage your strengths and which ones are just kind of misaligned with the kinds of things you enjoy. And so use the flexibility that academia provides to find a mode of operation that lets you be happy and lets you be happy. One last point that I would make is that I'm surprised by how stressed out people tend to be about tenure. I wasn't stressed about it at all throughout my, from like right when I started as an assistant professor all the way through when I got tenure a couple of years ago. And I find it very surprising that others are so stressed. And the reason for this is if you look at the statistics, except for very few institutions, at most places, you're more or less guaranteed to get tenure, right? There is a tenure line, there is a tenure position at the other end that you have been hired for. And so there is no reason for anyone to not give you tenure, right? So you almost kind of have to very explicitly mess up in some way for you to not get tenure. And as long as you're doing somewhat reasonable things, you don't have to be like a quote unquote rock star. I'm not a big fan of that phrase, but you don't have to be sort of what you think would be amazing success or amazingly productive or amazing of anything. I think if you're just more or less doing reasonable things on a day-to-day basis, you're more or less guaranteed to get tenure. And like I said, if you look at the statistics of your departments, and I'm talking in the context of computer science, right? I'm not talking more generally. And so, I do get surprised that the stats are very much in contrast to how concerned junior faculty seem to be about tenure, and that just doesn't line up for me. So, I would highly recommend not stressing out over it, just doing your thing. They've hired you, they want you to get tenure, you want to get tenure, everything is aligned, everything's going to most likely work out. And the only reason I'm not saying is guaranteed to work out is because obviously no one can guarantee it, but the probability of not working out is very, very low. And I feel like people take stress that is just disproportionate to what that probability is. Even if I think about the expected cost, that I know if you don't get tenure, that's terrible. But even then, the probability is so low that I think the stress is not justified. And I'm happy to chat about this more if anyone's interested. So I think that's all I have. I think have fun. Do what you enjoy. Do what you're interested in. Create an environment where your students can do what they enjoy and what they are interested in. Try and maximize those sparks of joy. Try and minimize things that drain you out, drain your energy out. Look out for your students. Promote their work. Promote them. I think everything else tends to kind of work out. So this probably wasn't an exhaustive list. I probably haven't covered every single aspect of being faculty, but these were just things that came into mind when I was trying to look back and think about what are things that went well or what are things I had done differently from what I did. And so this is just a list of those. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I hope you found this useful. Thanks.